Hello. Should I use this mic? Sorry. Lots of mics, hot mics. Okay. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Becky Bloom, Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Southern Utah Museum of Art, otherwise known as SUMA. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this discussion in connection to our exhibition, Reclaiming Agency, Ukrainian Women Photographers Today. So before I give a brief introduction to the exhibition, which I hope you all will visit before it closes on December 23rd, if you haven't already, and before I introduce you to our illustrious panelists, I need to say a couple of thank yous. First and foremost, this exhibition was conceived and curated with great speed and urgency by a former faculty member, Dr. Joanna Maruzak. Unfortunately, she's had to go to Poland to care for her ailing mother, but this is her project, her vision, and it was through her great efforts that we were able to bring these photographs and these photographic perspectives to SUMA. So I merely helped facilitate, curate, and edit her text. So I'm a sort of surrogate for Joanna today. Secondly, I would like to express my deep gratitude to the Dixie and Ann Leavitt Family Foundation for supporting the exhibition and today's talk and for attending today's event. And of course, thank you also for your brilliant granddaughter. Danielle, who's right here. Finally, I have to thank the 10 photographers who, in spite of extreme obstacles, have managed to send us their image files, their loan agreements, and artist statements from various corners of Ukraine and across Europe. And several of them have participated in a roundtable that is transcribed in this small catalog that we produced for this exhibition. That's in the gallery to peruse and also available in the gift shop and online for purchase. That's my shameless plug. And Marina Brdovska, who's here joining us via Zoom from Bulgaria, she and a couple other photographers also joined another sort of roundtable earlier this semester for the Art Insights class. So it's pretty remarkable that we were able to put this exhibition together and that we continue to be able to engage these amazing photographers. So thank you to all who have contributed to this show. I don't want to take up too much time talking about the exhibition and risk spoiling the experience of seeing these images and reading Joanna's text in person just across the street. So I'll just give a brief overview so you have some kind of context and show some highlights from the different sections that we have. Reclaiming Agency, Ukrainian Women Photographers Today presents works by 10 Ukrainian female photographers who have all been active in the decades following Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. The youngest photographer was born in 2001, and I believe the oldest, if you can even say that, was born in 1978. So we have 2 or 3 generations represented, including those who have lived sort of during the Soviet era, those sort of in the transitional period, and those in the sort of post-Soviet period, but all of which have experienced just in the last 10 years uprisings, conflict, and of course, war. So Reclaiming Agency, the title itself, refers to kind of 2 themes of the exhibition. During the Soviet period, photography was not an approved medium or state medium of the communist regime, and so it was kind of forced into underground movements that were largely male-dominated. So in the Ukraine, this situation continued beyond the Soviet period into the 21st century, and it was only in the late 2000s that a number of women artist photographers began to grow. More and more women have joined men in taking private courses in photography, despite the continued dearth of university-level programs in the medium. So this exhibition really gives platform to these women photographers, this growing community, and gives a platform to the groundbreaking voices and a new audience for their singular visions. In this exhibition, we see a reclaiming of agency over the photographic medium itself, but we also see a reclaiming of agency over the personal and especially the public narratives these photographers express in their work. Narratives that have been dominated, certainly in recent months, by Western media coverage of the war against Russia. Although the cultural, political, and military conflicts of the past and the present are conveyed in documentary and metaphorical ways by some of these women artists, these various upheavals have caused havoc in the lives of all of them. Amidst chaos and despair, these various upheavals amidst chaos and despair, photography has allowed these women to reclaim agency over the rich and diverse narratives of their lives, their community, and their country. These photographs show their worlds as views through their unique lenses. So this is not a war photography show, however. Apart from one photo series, or really 2 photographs, all the works in this exhibition were created before February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. These photos span a wide array of topics. Some focus on the lives of common Ukrainian people, while others interrogate the remnants of the Soviet past, creating complex new associations with the Russian occupation in eastern Ukraine. And still others reflect on the revolution of dignity, or the Maidan, you'll have to correct my pronunciation, of 2014, and the sense of impending danger felt at that time. The pieces in this exhibition demonstrate how photographic agency can be exercised with both humor and resilience. So there are 4 sections that I will very quickly go through and show some highlights. We have traces of the present, or traces in the present, which focus on the ways that the Soviet past kind of permeate the present, both in sort of humorous ways of, as in this look group photograph of sort of repurposing an old photograph of Soviet Russia, Red Square by Cartier-Bresson, famous European photographer, poking fun at it. And Marina Brodowska, who joins us today, photographs them Kiev crematorium. She has a series about this. And Olena Bologina, who photographs these remnants, even though there was efforts in the last decade to kind of eliminate physical and sort of material, visual traces of the Soviet past, they still are present and kind of ubiquitous, especially in public places. So this section kind of talks about the complexity of politicized public places. Then we have Growing Up and Growing Old, which I'm sure Danielle will talk about today, where some of these works show the effects of the Russian military aggression on the lives of children and adults in the eastern region of Donbass, a term that I'm sure many of us are more familiar than ever before, since this is an area that has also recently been illegally annexed and claimed by Russia, where others speak more broadly about the problems of childhood or old age. So some of these works are very personal, depicting family members and the artist's own experiences, and others document strangers and acquaintances. The third section is called Performing Gender Identity. And so these 3 artists that are featured, we have a selection of photographs here from them, address the complexities of gender identities, but through very different photographic subjects and techniques. These are maybe the most interesting and kind of diverse section. And then we have the whirlwind of politics. So we have, these are all by the same artist. You can see the ones on my right, your left, are the 2 photographs from the current war in Ukraine from 2022. Of course, a refugee. This artist has been living in Bucha, which now we know has been the site of atrocities. And this is an earlier series that also deals with sort of forced migration due to conflict. This artist is from I think she's from Donbass as well. Donbass, excuse me. So this gives you a little taste of some of the themes and the varieties and the diversity of photography, of photographic subjects, and even photographic techniques that are employed. So maybe this, for those of you who haven't visited the exhibition or maybe want to visit it anew, after this should whet your appetite for some good photography. So with that, I'd like to introduce our 2 panelists today. Danielle Leavitt-Quist, here sitting on the stage, received her BA in Russian and Women and Gender Studies from BYU. She's currently a PhD candidate in history at Harvard University and a scholar of the Soviet Union and modern Ukraine. Her research explores how Soviet thought about human age from the Soviet Union's birth to its death, and she focuses on ways in which science, politics, and society came together to create dominant norms and perceptions of chronological age and lifespan over the course of the Soviet 20th century, arguing that ideas about age mirrored the aging of the Soviet state and reflected both its visions of and fears for the future. So she's going to give us kind of some context to understand Ukraine in the present and the past. And then we have Marina Brodowska, who has 4 pieces in our exhibition that you see here, including this amazing photo collage, which is kind of the key. There she is, this key piece. And she has a photo book called My Dear Vera, which we have both in a case as an object, and also we acquired an extra copy so that you can actually peruse it. So Marina joins us from Bulgaria. She's a Ukrainian photographer, naturally. She has studied photography at various schools in Kyiv, beginning in 2008, and earned a degree in arts management from Dragomanova University of Kyiv in 2019. Her work has been exhibited in shows in Kyiv, in Paris, Berlin, Italy, among other places besides SUMA, which seems to pale in comparison to some of these illustrious cities. And her photo book, My Dear Vera, which again, you can peruse, thumb through, and purchase online, also a shameless plug, is on display at SUMA and has won several awards. So we're gonna begin with Marina. We'll have some time at the end of the program for Q&A, but I just invite Marina to talk a little bit about her work, her process, her inspiration, and so on. Thank you, Marina.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a big pleasure and honor for me to be in this exhibition, and I'm really impressed how it looked like and how it's made. And a few words about me. I'm a photographer and artist from Ukraine, and I live in Kiev before the war. Now I had to move, but I hope to come back soon. Yes, and I work mostly with collages, photography, and I make photo books. I have already made 2. One is on your exhibition. Maybe you have seen it. It's My Dear Vera. And another one is made the year after, but it's only in Ukrainian language. Maybe we'll have another translation. And now I also work on new projects about war, about my experience, and it's also collages and photography.
So thank you. We'll have ample time to ask Marina some more questions and engage in some conversation once we hear from Danielle. So it's my pleasure to invite Danielle Leavitt-Quist up to give some comments.
Thank you. Let's see here. Oh, thanks. Take my notes. Is it better to use this or this?
I think this.
Okay. Well, it is so wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I am really glad to be back here in Cedar City and at SUU. Cedar City is an important place for me personally. I grew up coming here as a kid, and so much of my family lives here. So it's an important place for me in terms of my own personal identity. And I'm especially glad to be here to talk about Ukraine, another place that has been fundamental in shaping how I think and who I am. And the confluence of these 2 places today at this event feels to me very significant. So thank you. And thank you to Becky and Jessica and Ioana for arranging such an excellent exhibit. The pieces in this exhibit are really, really excellent. And I want to thank all of you for coming today, for showing interest in these pieces, and I consider your presence here at this event an indication of solidarity with Ukrainians, and I'm grateful for your coming. I regularly ask myself and am regularly asked by other people what can be done to help Ukrainians. And beyond the obvious answer of providing financial support for those who are suffering from acute humanitarian crises, and providing financial support and political support for providing Ukraine with the necessary materials and weapons to ensure a Ukrainian victory over Russia. The most obvious answer to this question, what can I do to support Ukrainians, is, in my mind, to continue actively caring about the war in Ukraine. And I think being here today, seeking out accurate information about the war, attempting to deepen your understanding of Ukrainian history and culture is not a minor way of supporting Ukraine. I think it's a really important way of building a global community that is actively engaged in understanding Ukraine and the events that are happening there. So thank you for being here. I want to center my remarks today on some of the big themes that I see in this exhibit and how they interact with the historical context of Ukrainian society and its culture. The first theme that seems to me to pervade most of these pieces is how to make sense of the Soviet past, and specifically how to make sense of Ukraine's Soviet past. The second theme has to do with the meanings of human age. Becky talked a bit about this in her introduction. The relationship between generations and the unique generational divides that really characterize human relationships in Ukraine. The third theme seems broad but fundamental to this exhibit, which is, from the perspective of these photographers, who are we as Ukrainians? And especially, who are we as Ukrainian women? So, to begin with the first theme, which is making sense of the Ukrainian past, I want to begin with this photograph, which I'll get to in just a minute. I see in many of the photographs, and especially this one, that the artists are grappling with this Soviet past, a past which is in many ways as different from contemporary Ukraine as any past could be. And yet, remnants of this Soviet society and state are fundamentally embedded in the realities of every Ukrainian's everyday life. So how to make sense of that dissonance is something that I see as very fundamental to this exhibit. And I want to explore a little bit of that Soviet history with you, and how we can see attempts to reckon with it in this photography. One of the most important things to understand about Ukraine is, if its history seems confusing, it's because it is. Ukraine has been in the middle of things for hundreds of years, toggling between empires and different regimes, the people on its territory and its territory consistently in flux as different imperial forces sought to control it. The Russian Empire to the east, the Austro-Hungarian and Polish empires to the west, and then, of course, in the 20th century, the Soviet Union. It is a country which has lost its political classes and political chances over and over and over again. And this is fundamental to the Ukrainian psyche. Ukraine has nonetheless a very old national idea, an idea that goes back into the 17th century at least, and much further, many argue. When I say national idea, what I mean is a sense of unique identity, unique selfhood as Ukrainians, a group distinct from Russians, Belarusians, Poles. And this is one of the basic ideas under attack in today's war against Ukraine, is that Ukrainians don't actually exist as a distinct people or nation, and therefore don't really have the right to their own sovereign state. But the idea of Ukrainian nationhood and a Ukrainian national identity is a very old one, and unfortunately one that has been marred and obscured through the imperial efforts of multiple different regimes, the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union most specifically. Ukraine had one brief period of independence following World War I, approximately 3 years, but it was unable to establish a durable state in the early 20th century for a variety of reasons. Only after 1991, after the end of the Soviet Union, has Ukraine really had its first free generation and its first chance to build a democracy with that generation, based on this unique national identity. So the photographers here are exploring this and trying to make sense of this long history within the Soviet Union, a relatively traumatizing history, a history that has been, like I said, manipulated and obscured for political expediency for many decades and continues to be today. And how do we reckon with who we are today and everything that came before? So one of the most striking images for me is this. This is by Yulia Krivich, and it's called Legs of the Petrovsky Monument, Ilyich Palace of Culture. This image depicts centrally the broken off legs of a statue in a former Soviet palace of culture, which I'll explain what that meant in just a moment. The title suggests that the legs belong to Petrovsky, who was a Ukrainian communist leader under Stalin, and one of the leaders in the 1930s who was responsible for implementing Stalin's policy of agricultural collectivization, which led to the starvation of millions of Ukrainians. This event, the starvation, the forced famine, is known as the Holodomor, or death by hunger, which was obscured for several decades by Soviet authorities and was forbidden to be spoken of or written about. It wasn't talked about at the time. In the 1930s, Soviet propaganda actually insisted that if you mentioned hunger in reference to Ukraine, you were labeled an ally of Hitler. Or people who tried to organize humanitarian assistance for starving Ukrainians were labeled Hitler helpers. So it's interesting, actually, that the Russian use of the term Nazi to describe those who want to help Ukraine actually originates in the 1930s with this famine, artificial famine. And of course, knowledge about the Holodomor remained strikingly, hauntingly limited for many decades. People who died during the Holodomor were usually unable to leave any kind of trace behind. So, death by hunger is a slow death, and one historian who I admire, Tim Snyder, has identified this as a slow death, one that's typically preceded by mental breakdown and social breakdown. And so there are very few people who are able to chronicle this massively traumatizing event, which claimed the lives of literal millions of people. The chronicles that we do have are often people who are passing through the starving countryside, usually people who are well-fed themselves, Polish or Italian diplomats, for example, who were able to document some of what they saw around them. We have some photographs, but again, hauntingly few photographs. But of course, even though this event was prohibited from being documented and prohibited from being discussed, and discourse about this incredible starvation of millions of people was obscured from the society, the event didn't disappear. People knew from their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents who lived, who saw, that there was this deep, acute trauma related to hunger. In the 1980s, when the USSR under Gorbachev began policies of increasing openness related to the Soviet past, Ukrainians began talking more earnestly about the artificial famine. And then since 1991, when the Soviet Communist Party archives opened up, people have been able to find documentation, for example, from local Communist Party officials who were talking about the hunger and trying to make, sense of what to do. And the history of the Holodomor has become extremely well established by Ukrainian as well as Western scholars. So in many ways, this event, the Holodomor, became quite central to Ukrainians' understanding of the Soviet past. And I think it's no coincidence that the central feature here in this photograph are the cut-off legs of one of the men who helped to implement that policy. And the Holodomor, as central to Ukrainian understanding of their Soviet past, is not central just for the event itself, but because of what it represents, that Ukrainians were targeted and starved by those leading in Moscow, that information about their experience and heritage has been obscured and destroyed, that the Soviet Union not only did not bring enlightenment, equality, and progress to the masses as it promised, it brought destruction to millions of Ukrainians, and a fragmented sense of identity. So this picture, for me, represents Ukrainian society reckoning with that dark past, the remnants of which are still very present in Ukrainian society. Interestingly, the building that this statue is in, this Ilyich Palace of Culture, was one of thousands of similar palaces that were built in the early Soviet Union. This one is in the city of Dnipropetrovsk, Petrovsk, named after this fellow Petrovsky. Every town or collective farm in the Soviet Union was equipped with a palace of culture, which was where basically the state carried out a variety of leisure and entertainment and enlightenment activities. This specific complex was equipped with several auditoriums and entertainment halls for concerts, sports, theater productions. They had over 20 children's classrooms for teaching kids in after-school programs and on holidays. The Palace of Culture concept was in many ways devised as a replacement for the I guess, moral guidance and community that was traditionally provided by the church, which was outlawed in Soviet society. And so the Palace of Culture became, in many ways, the Soviet church. This is where people came to experience community, where they came to be taught, where they came to have entertainment. So this picture, which shows the broken legs of Petrovsky inside a crumbling and decaying palace of culture, is commentary on a broader relationship with everything that those represent. They are still present in Ukraine. These things haven't been torn down, but it's decaying, it's vandalized. This grand hall where people came for decades from their homes and factories and farms to seek community and leisure, where Ukrainians who are still alive today spent good portions of their youth and childhood coming to understand themselves and their relationship with the world, is now a haunting relic of that bygone society and the dark things that it represented for Ukrainians. This photo and so many of the pieces in the exhibit speak to the fact that the collapse of the USSR was and remains a process. It was not something that started and ended in 1991. So in many ways, the notion of a collapse or the word collapse to describe what happened in 1991 is not entirely accurate. It's a little bit of a misnomer because what happened is still happening. The remnants of that society, infrastructural, economic, governmental, psychological, continue to be present, although deteriorating over time. A more accurate description is dissolve, a dissolution which takes place over the course of many years and is a complicated process of decolonization and reckoning that's still occurring today, as the war in Ukraine would suggest. In many ways, this war in Ukraine, although the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was hailed as being so remarkably bloodless, the war in Ukraine waged against Ukrainians by Russians is in many ways a delayed effect of that collapse, proving to be extraordinarily violent in nature. The second theme that I want to talk about is the nature of generations and human age, childhood, old age, youth. I think one of the reasons this is such a salient theme in Ukraine is because every living generation in Ukraine has experienced such dramatically different versions of Ukraine. This is something that Becky talked about in her introductory remarks. Even the photographers included in this exhibit, although they are relatively young, like Becky said as well, have experienced dramatically different versions of this country. These three distinct generations, even leading only to, I think the oldest member of the exhibit is 49 or something, experienced coming of age in the Soviet Union, experienced coming of age in the 1990s, which is many ways a very distinct era in and of itself, one of economic depravity and political confusion. And then the youngest presenter, or the youngest artist, was born in the early 2000s, an era that represented in many ways a new type of Ukrainian nation and Ukrainian identity. In the United States, I find it interesting that, or maybe around the world, I don't think this is necessarily unique only to Ukraine, but it's, I think, something worth noting that in the United States, or at least in the society that I experience, different generations are distinguished by seeing the same events differently through different lenses, and we call it a generation gap. But in Ukraine, each generation actually experiences fundamentally different events, not only seeing them differently, but experiencing new regimes, new revolutions, new wars, new states, and this has characterized an acute sense of generational division in Ukraine that many Ukrainians continue to try and reckon with. That being said, these generational relationships are extremely important to Ukrainians, and I think this is something that Elena Morozova is trying to explore here in this Granny series, where you see this old woman, a remnant very classically of this Soviet past. She was likely a child in World War II. You can see on the wall is hanging a very classic Soviet rug, and hanging a rug on the wall was a very classic Soviet behavior. It kept the apartment warmer in lieu of wallpaper. And you see these children looking in on her, this kind of gaze on the older generation and all that she represents. Here in the second photo, you see a child who is pretending to be a doctor or to heal this old grandmother, and I sense that it's exploring a relationship that the young have to the old, or an obligation that the young have to the old, to help them to make sense of the trauma that they experienced in the former regimes that they experienced. And here, here's, I guess, the progression of these photographs: this dazed mind, confused mind of the grandmother, and then game over, indicating the grandmother's eventual death. One of the photographs that I find most interesting was this by Polina Polikarpova, which depicts a young girl traveling or gazing out from the back window of a car called a Lada. This is an old classic Soviet car, one of the most classic Soviet vehicles that was ubiquitous in that society, and seems to me to suggest traveling through the world, looking out and making sense of the world through a lens provided by the Soviet Union specifically. And this haunting suggestion that how youth's eyes are formed in many ways how youth's eyes were formed, how they see the world, was something that the Soviet Union continues to bear on them. The last photos, I guess, that I'll share from this portion on generations and age has to do with the way that the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the collapse of that state continues to bear down on young people, especially young people in war zones. Here you see a young boy with a barricaded window in the Donbass region. This is called schoolboy, meaning he's at school, trying to learn, to read, to write, to do math under the ever-present acute threat of war and of missiles. And here you see a playground in Donetsk using rocks and old beaten up toys and Barbies. And there's this sense that children today, 20, 30 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, this process began, are still bearing the brunt of that collapse and still living in war zones. The third theme that I want to explore is who are we, from the perspective of the photographers, who are we as Ukrainians? Since 1991, Ukraine has established or further expanded this national identity that I talked about at the beginning, I think around 3 basic ideas. And I want to explore those basic ideas here in terms of what I see in this exhibit. One of those ideas is plurality, meaning that the nation is not homogenous. It's a nation that is made up of many different religions, many different people from many different origins, different languages. This is a really big sticking point in Ukraine, whether you speak Ukrainian or Russian, but this is something that Ukrainians are learning to manage, is how do we create a unified national identity even though we are so fundamentally different, many of us. All Ukrainian, but speaking literally in different parts of the country, different languages, practicing different religions. And I think that this photograph very aptly describes or depicts that reality. That it's called, I love the title of this piece, I Carry All My Things With Me, which you can see here wheat on the left side, your right side of the vest. You can see kind of a traditional headwear in some ways, other aspects of Ukrainian landscape, and depicts this somewhat faceless person traveling through what is otherwise a fairly dark-looking world, carrying these precious aspects of land with her. And I think that is something that Ukrainians are developing, building as they create a national identity based on this non-homogeneity. The second idea I think that is characteristic of Ukraine is the idea of the future. So in many ways, Russia is a society and a state that is defined by its mythical relationship to some mythical past. But Ukraine seems to be tilted more toward the future, toward what young people can achieve, what Europe or a future oriented toward Europe might offer them. And I guess the third part of Ukrainian identity is that orientation toward the West, towards Europe. And I see a lot of these themes represented in this work. Here you can see, I love these pictures by Bella Logachova depicting a very, very Soviet-looking woman in the south of Ukraine, but nonetheless including it in this exploration of who are we as Ukrainians, this inclusive, more or less, idea that not everyone in Ukraine is going to be an intellectual Ukrainian-speaking city dweller. Some remain, fish sellers at rural markets in the southeast. Here on the left, Marina Frolova's picture exploring Ukraine's complicated relationship with gender and homophobia and xenophobia. Here on the left, we see a young girl with her collection of Harry Potter materials, indicating this obsessive youthful interest in the West and an oriented gaze toward the West. The last image that I think helps to characterize who are we as Ukrainians is this by Olena Bulygina, depicting a very Soviet hall in the eastern part of Ukraine. Stakhanov, which is today called Kadiivka, is a small town in the Donbass, currently illegally annexed by Russia, occupied by Russia, where you have this old Soviet rug, this very classic Soviet flooring, probably chairs that are from the 70s or 80s, and Soviet realist art hanging on the walls, juxtaposed against Ukrainian voting stalls, hanging these, Ukrainian national colors. And I love this photo. I love this photo for a variety of reasons. I think when people in the West look at Ukraine, they're sometimes confused and think, well, there's all these people who think different things, and they're speaking these different languages, and this history is complicated and honestly kind of a mess. And I love this picture because I think it represents one of the best parts of democracy, which is that if democracy is going to work in the 21st century really at all, it has to be able to work in a society like Ukraine. It has to be able to work in a society where people are complicated and multicultural, where the situations are not straightforward and not homogenous. And in that sense, I look at Ukraine as being an exemplary model for the world in what democracy can and could look like for any society that is struggling with disparate identities, disparate ideas. And another way I think that Ukraine is exemplary for the 21st century is how it continues to defend democracy at such high stakes. I love that this photo, I think, represents that. I think in some ways we've gotten, used to this idea that democracy is something that just comes to us de facto because we're like capitalist or something, or it comes to us because we've inherited it. But really, that's all nonsense. And the reality is that democracy really can only exist if you're willing to take extreme human risk to defend it. And I admire that most about Ukrainians today. And I think this photo represents that despite a haunted, very unlikely past, that stripped Ukraine of its political chances and its ability to achieve in many different eras this people-led democracy, it still defends it today. Ukrainians are giving an incredible example of what happens, that regardless of what happens in this war, they're willing to take very dangerous human risks to defend this idea. And I'm grateful to Ukrainians for that. I hope we can all learn from that. And I think as we watch Ukraine, we can come away with inspiration for how to defend our own society. Thank you.
So much. Can we turn this mic on? Hello. Thank you so much. That was amazing. It gave such fascinating context. I learned so much. Maybe we can we bring Marina back onto our Wizard of Oz screen? Hi, Marina.
Hi.
I have so many questions, but I wanted to bring Marina back and ask her to respond to some of the things that you brought up, the themes that you brought up in your comments, especially about this idea of the post-Soviet world, the sort of transition and notions of identity, of national identity, of personal identity. So Marina, I was wondering if you can comment on how through your photography, you express notions of personal identity, of national identity, and maybe respond to, because I know that you have those two amazing photographs of the Kiev crematorium, of how the remnants of the Soviet past also play into your sort of chosen subject matter. That's like 3 questions in one. But if you can talk a little bit about, identity in terms of national identity, personal identity, and post-Soviet life.
Okay. If I will forgot something, I will ask again.
Okay.
Yes, I'm absolutely agree that everything that we have till now is based on our past, and the Soviet period it was a long time. And as for me, I was actually born in 1988. And it was the last years of Soviet Ukraine. I even don't remember, of course, because I was 3 years old when we started being independent as an independent country. But a lot of things remained, as architecture, as the way of living, actually, and a lot of things. And it was like natural to see it from your childhood, and to think that those things and those like aesthetics is native. But when I grew older, yes, and when I saw another things, and I understood that it's only the part of a huge history that we have, this Soviet period, but it had a huge impact on us. I don't know, unfortunately, I think. Yes, and as for me, I have this series, a small series of architectural photography. It's presented on the exhibition as 2 photographs, but actually in the series there are more. It is photographs of Kiev crematorium building, and it's has a very tragic story, actually, and it's for me very deep, this conflict, because this crematorium was made like a huge, very big project of 3 artists, Ada Rybarchuk, and Melnichenko, and yes, and they worked on this project. It was a park of memory for 13 years. It was approved from the government. They received money, and they was building this huge project. It was a wall of memory, and this architectural building, and it was a project of their life. And at the end, when they were finishing, it was like direction from the government that need to stop, and it was just all cemented in front of eyes of those artists who was working on this. And it was made a decision that we will not continue this project because it's too controversial. And I think like this conflict says a lot about Soviet regime and how it behaved with the past, how it behaves with artists and with people and with memory. So the wall of memory, the park of memory was cemented in 1 day. And I made this series of photographs. It's actually, I think, the only one that I have with architecture. But for me, it was very important, like, to fixate this tragedy of artists, tragedy of history, and the beauty, actually, the beauty of the object itself. Because for me, this object is very beautiful. It's very extraordinary. So that's about Soviet past. And about identity, I would say, and about national identity, that this war that happens now, it's actually for most of Ukrainians, it's the war for being us. Is to, like, we fight to remain us, that we know that on the first day when this war started, Putin said that Ukraine didn't exist. It was like it's not a country, and it doesn't exist. It's like some abstract project. And when everything started, for me, as a for artist and for Ukraine, was very important to maintain this identity of my culture and my land, and to carry it with me, because when everything started, no one knew that how it will go on, and there were a lot of prognosis that we will be in 3 days, Ukraine will disappear. And for me, it was very important to carry it with me. And wherever will happen, and wherever I will live, in Ukraine or somewhere else, I want to save this culture and to take it with me. And I was making this series of collages. One of them is presented on the exhibition. And it was actually the series that I was making during the first months of war, when I tried to try to do something for me. And yeah, and it actually it helped me. It was like very like psychotherapical experience. Yes, and for me, like to remain a Ukrainian, and what it's mean for me to be a Ukrainian. Yes, and what was the third question?
I think that was it. I think that you beautifully expressed, answered my questions. I think that's interesting too what you say, that how your photography has been sort of part of a way of coping, would you say, as you've been in Bulgaria since I think many people who have artistic practice, no matter what they're going through, that this is a way to process, and perhaps the same now in this particular circumstance. But it was interesting in the round table that Joanna led, there was discussion about this, and Julia Krivich, who has several pieces in the show, she's been in Poland and she's been really active in collecting aid, and there are people who use art and activism and need to be active to process and deal with the sort of trauma of these circumstances. And I believe it was Julia Poe, who is part of the Look group and has another photo book, who is like, I'm not making art now. I just need to grow tomatoes on my fire escape and process. And so, there are different ways, right, that people deal with traumatic experiences. And some people are more active and use art. And even an artist needs to maybe take some time to process these events and sort of think about, what art means in this time. I wanted to talk a little bit, since both of you have highlighted these relics of the Soviet past in terms of architecture, and this is a theme in the exhibition. As you say, some of them have fallen into disrepair, have been knocked down perhaps, have been vandalized, but they're still there. There's a great website, side note, blogs that document abandoned Soviet monuments that are often done in this sort of brutalist style, like the crematorium, that look like these weird abandoned spaceships in Siberia and kind of far-flung areas. But what I think is important, and that sometimes we take for granted, is the this is a hard word, politicization of space and of architecture and architectural styles. And one of the things that Joanna mentions in her label for that Palace of Culture label is that it was done in a architectural style that was state approved in the 30s, but then was no longer approved later, and then was kind of underwent this decommunization in the 21st century. And so even architectural styles have political weight. And as I mentioned, that photography wasn't a state-sanctioned artistic medium. And so we often say all art is political, but here it's extra wielded by different regimes, and then kind of destroyed or abandoned by other regimes. So I was wondering if, Danielle, you can talk a little bit about this process of decommunization, maybe of communization, and then decommunization that has happened in sort of the public spaces in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a great question. What's so complicated about this question is that there's often layer upon layer upon layer of these different states and societies and regimes all in one space in Ukraine. And so making sense of what do we get rid of and what do we keep is really complicated. Marina's photos of the Kyiv crematorium were some of my favorite in the exhibit, and particularly because they perfectly express this very issue of the layering of different regimes and different memory. So the crematorium is in a huge cemetery in Kyiv called the Baikova Cemetery, which is the resting place of hundreds of really, really famous Ukrainians, and Ukrainians that have had a really big impact on the development of this national identity. So one of the most famous national poets, Lesa Ukrainka, was a Ukrainian poet in the early 20th century, very critical of the then Russian imperial regime. She is buried here, and she is credited with helping to develop some of this burgeoning Ukrainian identity before the Bolshevik Revolution, and several others are buried in the same cemetery. This crematorium, which was originally, as Marina was just saying, meant to be a place of memory. These artists created this crematorium as a place where people would potentially, come to connect to this human and national history, which was then immediately cemented in one day when it came under the threat of being when it became clear that it would potentially be too controversial. This wall of memory, this ostensible connection to Ukrainians' past, was just covered in concrete in one day by this regime. And to me, that is this very haunting symbolism. And so Ukrainians, I think, are in a very tough position in terms of what do we get rid of and what do we keep? Because people still have, even the Soviet past, which was brutal and awful in so many ways, was still a society in which lots of people lived their whole good lives. Lots of people raised their whole families. Lots of people have very personal, meaningful, nostalgic connections to these places that were built in this Stalinist constructivist style. And so I think it's been interesting to watch over the last 10 years, especially since Russia's invasion of Crimea, annexation of Crimea, and Russia's sponsoring of the war in Donbass. It's been interesting to watch how Ukrainians have tried to weigh what role does nostalgia play? What role does personal connection to this place play in what we choose to preserve, and what role does ideology play in what we choose to preserve? And I think that's something that Ukrainians, I think, are approaching kind of on a case-by-case basis, but many very Stalinist buildings remain very prominent in the center of Kyiv still. The main street, Khreshchatyk, which just recently featured, I guess, at the end of August in Ukraine's Independence Day, featured a very large, explicit parade against the Russian war, is against the backdrop of these Stalinist buildings all along the street. And that's interesting. And
yeah, especially when that past is directly connected to the conflict in the present.
Exactly.
It's fraught, to say the least.
Exactly. The layering is extremely complicated, and it's interesting to see them make sense of that.
And I think that we can relate as a country too, since there's, with our own history of monuments,
Yeah.
or our relationship to monuments of the past, particularly with Confederate monuments, and ways that discussion surrounding the dismantling of them and how to contextualize, and how, basically how public monuments, public spaces, architecture has this fraught history, and how we can deal with it in the present while not eliminating it, but somehow, memory is complex.
Yeah.
Who are the people erecting them? Like, there's layers here, but I think that we can see some of these parallels in America today.
Especially because in the case of Ukraine, one of the things that I think has limited Ukrainians from being able to flesh out a really robust national identity until really the present day is that there have been these constant breaks in historical memory and constant breaks in the nature of regimes. So, and constant, decolonization done by different regimes. So the Soviets decolonized the Soviet space after the after they took over from the Russian Empire. So all the streets were renamed, all the cities were renamed, all the schools are renamed. And that's complicated because then it's like, okay, so what street did I live? Where do you attach your like sense of space and sense of self when everything is constantly kind of turning over? The same thing has happened. The same thing began to happen more or less in 1991 and then really happened beginning in 2014. And so I think this is, like I said, a complicated thing, how to maintain some uninterrupted duration, some longevity in your relationship with the past, while you still need to remove from the present things that represent very dark parts of the past.
How are we doing on time? Sorry, I've lost it. We're close. Maybe we can ask a couple of questions. Dr. Kent-Marvik? Yep. Here.
I have a question for Ms. Brodowska.
Talk a little closer, maybe.
Okay, so there we go. I'm interested in your choice of medium and whether that can also be related to identity. The reason is I'm thinking of Hannah Höch, a Dada artist who is, I think, increasingly often correctly credited as the creator of photomontage, photo collage, a German artist of the early 20th century. And she used that medium primarily to explore her own identity and the identity of women in early 20th century urban European culture. And then I think of our own, you were mentioning, Becky, in passing, how this can be connected with the United States and our own current dilemmas. Deborah Roberts, I don't know if you're familiar with her work. She is a contemporary Black American collage artist who likewise uses that medium to explore identity. In her case, derived mostly from her own childhood as a black girl growing up in the South at the end of Jim Crow and post-Jim Crow, which means a period of more or less institutionalized and culture-wide racist policy. And this is related to what you were saying about processing one's experience. Then the other thing that I couldn't help noticing is this connection with how everything is broken up and there are these layers on layers. And it seemed to me almost as if you were describing the collage itself, that photo collage itself. Do you have anything to say on that?
Can you talk about your choice to use photo collage with regards to, identity,
Yeah,
fragmentation?
Yeah, I don't know how I came to it. Actually, I don't remember, but it was my choice. I think it started when I started making this book of my dear Vera, and it is a book about friendship between me and her, and I found out this process of making another reality, but based on the pieces of real pictures and I started playing with these different layers, with cutting out something that's also adds some meaning when there is nothing, when you see like the whole, and when you make additional layers, but that is based on some real pictures. And yes, for me, it became the best way, the best medium to express myself, my ideas, and I agree that for like self expressing and for studying things that are connected with your personal world, and it is, for me, it is the best technique, because you play with the reality, you play with the material, and you find more new meanings with even the same material all the time. Yeah, so I came to it intuitively, but this definitely my medium, my way to make these stories that I make.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Hi. This is a little bit different, but for a Ukrainian and a scholar of the region, I'm reading Snyder's book, The Road to Unfreedom, and what I'm finding fascinating in that book is the mythological, mystical road that Putin is just barreling down, you know, from Ilyin and Dugin and all these crazy lunatics, basically. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. They're insane. And I'm wondering what you as a scholar and you as a Ukrainian person feel about how, you know, masses of the Russian people utterly buy this mystical, mythological, total lie and falsehood of eternity, and how some don't. Many young people have left Russia, but also how in Ukraine there's the same dynamic, but kind of flipped, where most Ukrainians don't buy it, but there are still some who do. And I'm just wondering if you could both expand upon it, because I recommend the book to everybody, The Road to Unfreedom. It's utterly fascinating. Thank you.
Marina, would you like to comment first about the sort of myth of, I don't even know, of Russia, of the lineage that Putin is kind of, you know, claiming to be an inheritor of, that undermines the Volodymyr versus Vladimir? I've heard a story about that on NPR, my main news source of all things. Good.
Yeah, I think like for me, I was so naive because when I heard the speech of Putin on the first day, I didn't believe that it's true. I was absolutely sure that it's like a deep fake or some joke, and it's not real Putin, because normal person could not say such things. So I was really naive. I didn't believe that it's true. But then when I understood that it is, and after that, in 2 days, the war started, I was absolutely shocked. Yes, and I think that Russia has a this strong tradition of propaganda that they had practiced during Soviet time, and they know this technology very well. And what happens now with them and with people who believe in such very strange things, I don't know how to say it, like not with the bad words, but I think this is their tradition of propaganda, and that's what they do properly. They're just brainwashing, and that's the result of it. We see now how these people think, how they behave, how cruel they are, and this is the result of it. And this is, for me, it's a true evil that's need to be stopped somehow.
I guess my response would be twofold. One, that, you know, Putin lives in isolation. Putin lives in a different reality fundamentally, and I think really, you know, it's unclear how much of this stuff he fundamentally believes, but it wouldn't surprise me if he fundamentally believes all of this stuff. And I think a lot of people around him fundamentally believe this stuff because they also live in a world that is relatively, relatively cut off from different types of information that we're exposed to. And so I think it's hard for us to comprehend because we're consistently engaging with information that refutes, this whole worldview. But when you're not engaging ever with that information, there really are no limits to what you can choose to believe or come to believe. The second thing I would say regarding the people who support Putin or believe the ideologies and rhetoric that he promote would be that, yeah, similar to what Marina said, this is a society that is very accustomed to I would say, adjusting its behavior based on what the state requires of them, and doesn't necessarily mean, I think there are a lot of Russians that really believe this stuff. I think there are a lot of Russians that really are accustomed to choosing carefully what they choose, what they really believe. So how do I say this? At the end of the Soviet Union, although the Soviet Union, or I would say in the 1970s, although the Soviet Union had, was alive and well, more or less, a lot of people didn't really believe this, but it just kind of, this is in a book called Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More, kind of disengaged from belief, if that makes sense, kind of chose to make belief not a central aspect of how they lived. And I think this tendency is alive and well in Russia, just kind of disengaging from belief as an activity, because how do you live?
So there's a difference between believing and supporting, and I always think of it too, disengaging, but also for one's personal safety.
And to be fair, I feel a little bit uncomfortable like really defending Russians, because I think there are a lot of Russians who could do something, who are choosing to disengage from belief. But I mean, that being said, disengaging from belief is one way of coping with a situation that you have no control, or you feel like you have no control over. That being said, I think there are a lot of Russians who maybe aren't fully disengaging from belief, or who maybe really do believe, and are choosing to do nothing, and that's really a pity.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Danielle, for traveling from Cambridge. And thank you, Marina, for zooming in, beaming in from Bulgaria. And thanks again for participating in this important exhibition. And again, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And don't forget to go and see the exhibition if you haven't already. Great.